Welcome to another offline video, this time featuring 2 Stars and Stripes fighters. For this video, we will have Kuya playing George Washington on the left, a slower grindy fighter who bluffs using roost tokens to threaten powerful effects. On the right, we have Ron-Chon playing John Henry, a new addition to the melee powerhouse archetype who brings unparalleled mobility with his train tracks. John Henry starts and we are playing in the White House. We place on the track token, which lets John Henry effectively ignore that space for movement. It's only 1 now, but that will start building up as the game goes on. John Henry maneuvers and plays striking fire to get things started. He moves next to George, and while the way he gets there is illegal, he could reach there by going through the portal in the brown zone. John attacks with Hear That Cold Steel Ring, which George cancels with a feint. A perfect defense for George, given that the potential punishment of one of the 4 6s was definitely in the cards. George retaliates with an activated Agent 711 to knock them silly. Definitely the single scariest card in George's deck, John Henry can only stop it with Knock Them Silly specifically. George attacks again with a Lead Astray into a cool drink of water, dealing 2 damage. One thing George could have done differently was to attack with a Roost Lead Astray for the first attack, then attack with Roost Agent 711 for the second attack. John would have to defend with Knock Them Silly twice, or let George randomly discard. Notice how Ron-Chon didn't play Cool Drink of Water into the Roost Up attack, since he should be well aware of the potential consequences of losing combat there. In the meantime, both fighters take a break after an aggressive start, although one that in the end only led to 2 damage being dealt. Both guys just draw cards, though technically John gets the added benefit of getting to build his train tracks unpressured. While we're here, it's worth mentioning that the White House is a move tree center map, and if you're positioned in the center, it is very easy to chase after everyone. George walls up in the corner. The wall of them being in the same zone means that the threat of 9-pound hammer is real. John does only move 1 here, so George is safe to take. It ends up being a momentous shift, which George should be perfectly fine with. I found that George desperately needs to get full value out of every spy, as he really benefits from having both Sympathetic Stains, his version of Eliminate the Impossible, trigger. George goes into attack with a Roost Circumvent. Honestly a bit unlucky here for George, or lucky for John, as John defending with Deeds here actually means that Agent 711 or Sabotage would have triggered. Then, John Henry hits back with an 18-pound hammer into a feint. Technically, this could have been larger than life and the same thing would have happened here. And the fact this was a feint theoretically means that 18-pound hammer wouldn't get its effect anyway. So a perfect interaction for John honestly, as George was probably counting on a Hear That Cold Steel Ring. John goes in first action with Striking Fire, which gains him an action and allows for a double attack turn here. He attacks with 12-pound hammer and to make a stand, aka Moment to Stay. This deals no damage, but 12-pound hammer does trigger. Technically, either of 18-pound hammer or 9-pound hammer would have dealt either 3 damage or 2 damage respectively, so a great interaction for George. George gets sent out, and John just takes a chance to maneuver out. While John deals a lot of damage, I'd hesitate to call him an aggro fighter, as he likes to go in on his own pace. George maneuvers, then boosts with an allies everywhere. I think this card is one of George's strongest roost effects, as I've seen George heal 9 HP pretty consistently in his games. Making the opponent waste a card for a bait, and getting your HP up to potentially 23 is crazy. Then, George attacks with Agent 711 into Knock Them Silly. A bit unlucky for George, although I do think that the second Agent 711 be used as late as possible in the game to stress the opponent out. Ideally, at minimum, it should force a random discard from the opponent. John positions right next to the 3rd player starting space, though it is still in maneuver range of one of the spies. George takes the opportunity to keep the pressure up and sends a spy to go in. It ends up being a Sabotage into a Powered Shrew. No random discard happens again, and unfortunately for George, he doesn't get the Valor punish. Technically, Circumvent here would have been perfect against Powered Shrew. With the spy out of the way, John Henry does a simple maneuver attack into George. Probably not a hammer attack, as John didn't move up to 4 spaces / pats. It ends up being a momentous shift into Make a Stand, so it's fully blocked. George attacks first action with Lead Astray into Cool Drink of Water. You can think of Cool Drink as a 3-value defense that is susceptible to win combat effects, and that might heal you health with bait attacks like Regroup. George uses Lead Astrays after combat effect to move closer to his spies. There's still a gap there for John to attack George, but it will be easy for George to wall up again after if he wants to. We do see John consider going in, but he ends up just going to the center. With 2 of the spies still up and no more roost tokens available for mind games and effects, it would be the perfect time to play Sympathetic Stains right here. Instead, George goes into attack. It's a misinformation into another Cool Drink of Water. I think this makes perfect sense, as with 2 Knock Them Sillies out, misinformation is very likely to win combat now, while it has a high risk of losing into John's multiple 6s still remaining if used as a defense. Also, I'm not sure, but I think John misses ability a few times in this game, such as right now. It's technically mandatory, but let's just ignore it. John maneuver attacks with larger than life into Recruit to the ring, in what can only be described as a Giga Punish. It's 1 point of damage away from being a regroup defense, but at least it's not a feint doing nothing. While John is definitely a strong fighter, his defenses are generally a bit lackluster. When left to play his game, he shores up his weaknesses. George maneuvers, doing a bit of repositioning with the spies and himself. He leaves his spy next to John Henry, who throws an attack with a ruse. George attacks with Circumvent into Powered Shrew, dealing 3 damage by ignoring the value. It is worth mentioning that the spies only have Circumvent and Sabotage as ruse cards, so defending with a 3 at least blocks off Sabotage's powerful effect. Powered Shrew moves John Henry 2 spaces to the center, not quite in range to first action attack George. He does a maneuver, closing that gap, then attacks with 18-pound hammer and to make a stand. Technically, this is just a blank 6, so it only deals 1 damage. Although saying just is pretty ridiculous, it's a really strong card. George maneuvers out and walls up with the spies. I think at this point, George is desperately digging through to find the scheme, which would really help in either stopping John's aggression or removing defenses. John keeps the pressure up though, and moves into that little spot by the corner. He attacks the spy with a 9-pound hammer into recruit to the ring. 9-pound hammer does activate here, wiping out the 2 spies next to Washington. I think there's a minor error here as technically recruit to the ring activates first. A spy is defeated during combat, returns, then is killed again by 9-pound hammer. In any case, George backs off, but John Henry gives chase with the last striking fire. He attacks with Bring Down the Mountain into a feint, an interaction that George absolutely needed to still be in the game. Bring Down the Mountain can go up to a 10, which is a ridiculous amount of damage. John Henry attacks again, this time with a 9-pound hammer into Misinformation. Both fighters activate their card's conditions, so George takes 2 damage but recovers a ruse token. George plays Gather Information as a sort of panic button. It's not usually one of the cards you count on in most of George's games, but the option of having a superior riches beyond compare is pretty useful in these types of situations. John builds another track token. Though with a map this small and with so many tracks already on the board, I don't think it makes much of a difference. John gives chase once more, and attacks with a Hear That Cold Steel ring into an undercover agent. With this positioning, it doesn't really matter where George goes, as Cold Steel lets John move 1 then attack again. John thinks about what to play, but there are very few wrong choices at this point. He attacks with Larger Than Life into a Misinformation, dealing 2 damage and closing out the game. A bit of an unfortunate game there for George, with none of the sympathetic stains being played and only Circumvents triggering for ruse effects. However, this game was a good demonstration of John Henry's strengths as a fighter, being a mobile powerhouse who hits you with 4 6s, action gains, and ping effects. Finally, an offline video again after a long while. I want to give a shout out to Kuya for sending me this footage, as I still don't have a copy of Stars and Stripes of my own. If you guys somehow remember, Sean actually was the person who recorded the All Aboard Expo Grand Finals match between Heinz and Drew last year, acting as a human tripod and holding the phone up all throughout the match. That video ended up being one of my most viewed so far on my channel, so the act is appreciated. Now, he's made his own Facebook page where he makes content mostly regarding Unmatched. It is in Tagalog though for the international viewers, but it's worth checking out regardless. Link will be in the description below, and see you next time.